Our next speaker is Heidi Huber-Stearns, who's an assistant research professor and director of the Institute for Sustainable Environment at the University of Oregon. At Oregon, she conducts applied social science research on natural resources management in the western U.S. to inform policy and land management. She's also an associate director of the Ecosystem Workforce Program, which is a partnership between the University of Oregon and OSU. And the title of her talk today is Boundary Spanning to Collectively Manage Wildfire Risk in the West. Heidi?
Green. Oh, there we go.
During the introduction, I'll point out that we also have a study site in Cedar City around Wildfire. Are you trying to speak about that?
That's fine.
That's part of our work as well. So there is a Utah tie.
And yep, it went out again maybe. We'll see. Darren can come up here and talk about that instead too, if you'd like. When this gets too boring, he'll come up here and talk. So so I'm talking about 2 out of the 5 case studies that we actually have. So just really quickly, when we talk about boundary spanning, we're talking about boundary spanning activities, so work that people are doing together to achieve certain tasks, concepts around different ideas to achieve common goals, objects, so things that are supposed to help bridge knowledge gaps, kind of be a formation of different interests in a document, as well as organizations that are working across boundaries, either jurisdictional boundaries or across kind of science and applied boundaries or things like that, as well as these settings, these conducive settings. Where are there places on the landscape where you can actually do this type of work? And so the case studies that we're going to be talking about, it's actually great that I'm going at the end, because a lot of this has already been talked about as far as there was already work talked about yesterday that's in the South Platte Basin, which is where the Cache La Poudre watershed is, which is one of the case studies, and the other one we'll talk about is in New Mexico. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the places. I'm going to talk about how they relate to this boundary work, because a lot of this has been covered. But I will just say, overall, we focused on 2 areas, in this case 2 forested watershed areas that have had recent catastrophic wildfires and subsequent events, so flooding, things like that, that have impacted water quality. So these are 2 places where water quality and supply are a concern, as well as wildfire risk. In both these cases, there is a pretty significant amount of WUI, so people living in the wildland-urban interface or near it. We have mixed land ownerships, public, private, as well as other agencies. We have water utilities pulling from, in this case, the Poudre River, which runs through here. Our focus in, I realize that every time I turn it's going to get louder, so I apologize for that. Our focus in the Poudre watershed is really this upper watershed part, so kind of from Fort Collins above. But you'll notice that Fort Collins, Windsor, Greeley, Wellington, Loveland, all of these places are actually pulling water. One of their 2 main water sources is from the Cache La Poudre. And so in this landscape, we have a bunch of different organizations. We have what's called the Northern Colorado Fireshed Effort. There's a coalition for the Poudre River watershed, which was formed after the 2012 High Park fire, which you can see in red down here. Peaks to People, which is an emerging water fund effort, modeled a bit after the Rio Grande Water Fund, which also emerged after some of these fires. And then we also have other things that have existed on this landscape. We have fire-adapted communities, community wildfire protection programs, and other work that's been done to kind of deal with some of the wildfire risk already before Hayman Fire, as well as after. And then the other landscape is the Rio Grande Water Fund, which I'm not going to spend any time on talking too much about this, because Colin talked a lot about this yesterday. But again, in this landscape, there's the Rio Grande Water Fund itself. There's also the Greater Santa Fe Fireshed Coalition in the Santa Fe area. There are initiatives like the All Hands, All Lands Burn Team, as well as the same things that I just talked about in Colorado as well. There's CWPP's fire-adapted communities, people living in the wildland-urban interface. So we're talking about kind of a similar set of issues in these 2 landscapes. And again, you can tell that the land ownership on this map is pretty diverse as well. So in both of these cases, they've had fires in recent years, both within their watershed as well as in neighboring areas, which have either impacted source water or had some other concern for water treatment and drinking water, like we saw in the video yesterday in the Rio Grande, the flood of debris coming through. So when we think about how all of this could apply to other landscapes, so where are there other places that are dealing with similar challenges, and what types of things could we identify in those landscapes? that might help us understand where and how boundary spanning could take place. We start at the beginning with what we call focusing events or catalyzing events. I think we saw this in the Rio Grande and the South Platte, in the Flagstaff area. All of these places talk about a wildfire happened. In many cases, there's subsequent flooding or other events, and then people responded. It's not that there wasn't work going on before, but in a lot of places in the West, we see kind of the series of there's some kind of catalyzing event that occurs. People organize in new and different ways. Sometimes new organizations form, or sometimes organizations come together in different ways than they did before, and they try to figure out ways to address this. We saw this up and down the Colorado Front Range after the High Park fire, as well in the flooding in Strontia Springs that was talked about yesterday as well. There were 5 other memorandums of understanding signed with utilities with the Forest Service following the Denver water model that they have their partnership with the Forest Service, which has evolved over time, but we see kind of this cascading effect of wildfires and this kind of prompting of needing to respond. So if we think about that in what we call boundary spanning language, we see a couple things. So we see boundary spanning organizations. These are groups that are working across land ownership. So federal and state agencies, non-governmental organizations, water providers, private landowners. In some cases, these are entities that are already on this landscape. So for example, the Forest Stewards Guild, the Nature Conservancy, state and federal agencies, and others worked together to put together some of these groups that I'll talk a little bit about, but one of them being the Rio Grande Water Fund, which I think Colin's going to correct me on this, but it has 80 signatories, something like that. 85, okay, I was in the ballpark. So the point there being, it was a lot of existing organizations that came together in new and different ways to try to figure out how to deal with the risk on their landscape. We see the same thing outside of Fort Collins in the Upper Poudre, the Peaks to People project I talked about, the Water Fund, as well as the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed, both formed after the High Park fire in response to that. A lot of the people sitting at those tables, a lot of those efforts, when we talk to folks about this in our case studies, they really talked about this idea of musical chairs. There's a lot of the same people at the same organizations going to different meetings to talk about similar things. So it's kind of this idea of they're kind of shifting the chairs of where they are in the room, but they're trying to figure out how to get together and collectively respond to these events. The other thing that we see are boundary spanning concepts, so things that there's agreement around. So, in recent years after these fires in both of these landscapes, as well as other places in the West, we see groups talking about forested watershed restoration. There's some agreement on the types of restoration principles they might be using. So this is essentially the common language that organizations, coalitions, and networks are using to talk about the work that they're going to do in their watershed. There's also this kind of focused collective investment in both of these landscapes for water-related services, both through Peaks to People as well as through the Rio Grande Water Fund. These are water funds set up to receive investment to do work in the watershed, as well as less direct ways like some of these other nonprofit groups are going out and doing restoration work through grants and other funding that they've fundraised themselves. So we see folks kind of coming together around some of these concepts around what forested watershed restoration might look like. And then all of this leads to these conducive settings that I was talking about. So these places where when these pieces come together, you have an opportunity to do some more boundary spanning work. So these are landscapes that have multiple land ownerships, so you're spanning multiple land ownerships. These are landscapes that have things in place like fire adapted communities, Firewise, community wildfire protection programs, essentially places that have some awareness of what's going on with fire and might be interested in doing more or coming together in new and different ways to resolve these issues or deal with them at a broader scale. And this is where we also see some of the partnerships and coalitions and authorities forming. So things, again, like some of the organizations that are involved in these landscapes, putting together things like the All Hands, All Lands Burn program in northern New Mexico, which really focuses on implementing prescribed fire in collaborative manners. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but those types of initiatives are ways that people are trying to come together to resolve some of these issues. Boundary spanning activities are the work that people are doing together. And so these are things that we see happening across the West that have been talked about the last couple days. So risk mapping and assessment activities, essentially things that are prioritizing the landscape, regardless of land jurisdiction, right? This is the idea of putting a map down on the table and having everybody identify what their values and priorities are. In both of the landscapes that we looked at, they've actually had pods processes done. So these are potential operational delineations. This is a process by which it's essentially that idea of getting stakeholders together in a room, and in this case, it's involved national forests as well as other stakeholders to identify what their priorities are on the map, regardless, again, of land jurisdiction, where those priorities fall, where their values are, what things might be able to have some low-intensity fire, what things cannot, what areas to stay away from. This, goes back to a lot of the maps we saw yesterday in the South Platte, looking at things like where they're really important source water areas or reservoirs or things like that that we can't have any fire in. So that whole process that comes out of pods, as well as some of the related risk mapping activities, those can actually be used in mitigation work, as well as the hope is, and we've seen it work in some places, including in both Colorado and New Mexico, the hope is that that can also be used for suppression. So in times when you have naturally ignited wildfires that occur and there is the potential to manage for resource benefits, those types of maps and the work from pods can actually help understand where different values are on the landscape and the opportunities that there might be to manage a fire. It's a controversial topic, but it's something that both of these landscapes have used. And at the same time, it also helps to understand where there are essentially the no-go areas, where there are values at risk and suppression. And then the one other thing that you see happening between these areas and suppression is that sometimes fuel breaks or other things, if they're known ahead of time, can actually be used in the suppression process. So these types of activities are actually useful for both mitigation and suppression. And then there's some of these initiatives that I talked about, such as this All Lands Burn Team, and some of the work that we see happening in northern Colorado, like the Fireshed Coalition that was formed, that's state and federal agencies, nonprofits, and others in the area that are trying to think about their kind of northern Colorado area as a fireshed, similar to what we see happening in the Santa Fe fireshed area. So thinking carefully about how do you prioritize and strategize about the work that gets done in your fireshed. So they're thinking about it in terms of that instead of watersheds. As well as monitoring work. So boundary spanning activities around monitoring work can be really helpful for partners to see what did or didn't work in a project that they implemented, as well as what could be improved in the future. It also is helpful if you have kind of differing opinions on what treatments might be the most effective. This might be helpful to understand some of that. And then getting back to this idea of managing wildfire for resource benefits, this is another boundary spanning activity that can take place if there are wildfires that are under the appropriate conditions that can actually be managed for other resource benefits. There's an opportunity to use the connections that you've already made through all these processes, the maps that you've already created with priorities on them, maybe some of the lessons learned from these initiatives, as well as things like knowing how to do resource sharing and having agreements in place because you've already done prescribed fire work together. So all of that leads to the ability to be more prepared to actually manage fire when the opportunities arise. So then boundary spanning objects are fairly obvious. It's a map. These are the things that come out of the activities that you've done. So comprehensive plans, different water source prioritizations. You can see this in water plans that utilities have as well. Wildfire mitigation and suppression plans. These cover a lot of, it's not just what groups come out with as far as their priorities. This is also what utilities, businesses, and others are thinking about for their plans if and when a fire comes through. Then there's the super boring but really critical stuff. There are the memorandums of understanding, the partnership agreements, the contracts, who will work together and how. If you don't have these in place, this is one of the biggest obstacles that we hear from interviewees about how and why they can't actually get engines when they need them, where they need them for getting prescribed burning done, or they can't get trained crews when and where they need them. A lot of it has to do with some of these, again, probably boring to most people, but very important contractual arrangements about how you actually share resources, how you agree on your common goals and work together on that. And the same with collaborative charters, this idea of what we as a group are going to do together, what we're going to prioritize, what the roles are of the organizations that are participating in that. All of these things are actually really critical to forming how you work together, which then informs your ability to conduct both mitigation work and suppression work. And also post-fire rehab, but we won't get into that. So just a couple more things about boundary spanning. Some of the other things that we've had interviewees tell us about in Colorado and New Mexico about some of this boundary spanning work is that working together and doing a lot of this planning ahead of time means that there are a lot of things that can happen. So for example, the Forest Service can actually, during their NEPA analysis, have a lot of those values already mapped and identified. They can think carefully about where and how on the landscape they're going to do their environmental assessments that might align with either more prescribed work or might also provide opportunities for more managed fire that on acres that have been NEPA approved. And again, land managers and stakeholders can essentially do this pre-season and spatially explicit planning outside of the wildfire season. So when there's not a fire burning right in front of you, being able to make these decisions can be really helpful, at least to start to make the decisions. And partners can create a more supportive environment. This is something that we hear time and time again across the West. And it ties into this piece about prescribed fire. A lot of the things that we hear from organizations is that the ability to work with partners ahead of time, so to figure out how you work on a burn together, who brings what resources, who can fill what gaps, how you leverage each other's skills and expertise. All of that work is, I don't know what the right analogy is, maybe it's a little bit like speed dating, but you're kind of trying to figure out who can bring what to the table and what that looks like and what the right fit is. And so to do all of that work on a planned prescribed burn or other planned types of activities means that when you need wildfire suppression support or when you need to communicate, you've already established a lot of those relationships and you have a good understanding of who you can actually work with. It sounds really basic. One of my joys as a social scientist is that people tell me things and then I tell other people things. But we hear a lot from people that one of the biggest things that comes out of a lot of this work is that they know who to call, they know who to pick up the phone and call when they have an issue or when they need something. And a lot of those connections across the landscape seem very obvious, but often aren't made unless there are deliberate attempts through, for example, a lot of these initiatives that we see happening in Colorado and New Mexico to do that work together. A lot of this boundary spanning work, some of the other things that people talked about, is that it helps with more effective and targeted communications, like I was just talking about. It can facilitate easier information flows for decision making. And this is the other thing, it creates mechanisms for actual joint accountability and action. So this is really where the rubber hits the road and we're all in this together. If we're all trying to collectively manage this landscape and deal with some of the wildfire and water risks that we see happening on it, having those mechanisms in place to hold people accountable and to have really clearly defined roles about who is contributing what and how is a really important part of this work. And then we also hear that stakeholder values are better recognized in suppression decisions when their values have been mapped and identified ahead of time through some of these prioritization processes. Again, like I mentioned before, fuels treatments can be used strategically during suppression in some cases. And then, depending on the landscape, we also hear a lot about how mitigation at small scales, strategically done at small scales, can add up to larger landscape scale plans. You can't always do everything at the large landscape scale level. Sometimes it's really about those smaller scales. And then I think the one other thing I would add that I missed in here somewhere is we also see the use of a lot of authorities. So we have a lot of partners that talk about the use of things like CFLRP or Joint Chiefs, either being directly helpful in this work or helping them build some existing relationships they could build off of for future work. We also see that with things like Good Neighbor Authority and other things like that. Essentially, these authorities that allow different entities to work across boundaries. Those are a really important part of the boring policy and contractual process that happens that allows a lot of these agencies to actually have the authority to do that work. And I will stop there. We do have a project webpage about this project specifically, and then our other resources are up at our other websites.
Time for questions.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the role of catalyzing events. And a lot of the challenges that many of us in the room would be addressing are things that are slow catastrophes.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe non-native species invasion, it may be climate change, it could be some sort of slow insect depredation. Is there, do you have a sense of whether there's some, or have you run across experiences where there hasn't been a catalytic event or some way that we can get past that need for something really bad to happen before we start acting?
Yep, that's a good question. Yes, so there's all the things that you mentioned. So the question is, for the places that don't have these high-profile, catastrophic events happening, how do we kind of essentially appropriately motivate people, or what other ways can we move these programs forward? So yeah, like in the East, they deal a lot with source water protection programs, and also in the West places, I'm sure, with essentially development and encroachment, so that like death by 1,000 cuts. They're slower moving, but like you said, they have a lot of the same impacts. So what I talked about here is very specific to this type of landscape that needs essentially fire, flood, source water, giant population, right? So that's great for certain parts of the West as far as motivation. I've seen similar things with research we did on mountain pine beetle, which is slower moving, but the response to pine beetle, a lot of it comes down to latent capacity and authorities. So the latent capacity being kind of this, what are your existing resources that you have available because you might not get resources in time? What are the connections that you have? How well do you know your partners and how you can leverage their work and work across boundaries? I think a lot of the boundary pieces that I talked about are similar there. You don't have the same focusing event, like you said. I think that sometimes folks point to other landscapes. Like I've seen groups create programs like this because they saw what happened to someone else. And we see that a lot with water utilities. It's kind of that avoided cost, like the thing I was talking about in Colorado where Denver Water signed this MOU, and then you see kind of this cascade effects. There were some, of course, political pieces there that moved those forward, but at the same time, when I interviewed a lot of those people, a lot of what they talked about is we saw what happened in the watershed next to us, or we pull out of that reservoir too, and we didn't want that to happen to us. There's a bit of the avoided cost too. So I think there are ways, and some of those base pieces are still there. It's just kind of figuring out how you essentially motivate people. It's a good question. Darren.
Thanks, good job.
Yeah.
You made the excellent point that if we do prescribe fire in advance, we've got a lot of these relationships built, and I want to share with everybody, make sure everybody's aware that Utah does now have a prescribed fire council, and we're just starting our second year of existence, and our meetings tomorrow in Salt Lake City at 9 o'clock. So everybody who's interested is welcome to attend. Send me a message, and I'll patch you into that information.
Great, thanks, Darren. And I think we also have some other joint fire science work on policy barriers to prescribed fire in the West that I'm happy to share as well, looking at all the 11 states in the West and some of the barriers that we see, which in some places are pretty big, and in other places there are some creative workarounds. So,
Any more questions?
Well, thanks, Heidi. I'm bummed we didn't get to see the dance, but whatever.
Next time.
So you talked a little bit about the process of the boundary spanning process of sort of the speed dating, as you called it, with the prescribed fire. Are there other processes that you think are more effective than others, in addition to the risk assessment and sort of the mapping processes? Because I think we end up spending a lot of time in big roundtable meetings as a way to cross those boundaries, and I'm wondering how do we utilize those everybody's time a little bit more effectively to build stronger relationships so that phone call really means something.
Yeah, so your question is, are there things other than sitting around the table and kind of sharing some of those, like what other things would work to get people to establish some relationships? I think that usually people need, at least what we've seen is people need some kind of motivating thing to rally behind, whether it's, we've seen it with mountain pine beetle, with people going to get funding from different levels, or like having a thing. I think that something we hear the most, so prescribed fire is a good example of that because it's actually people working out in the field. A lot of what we hear about is that people will sit around the table for an extended period of time and talk about things, but then a lot of that changes when they actually get out in the field together and either plan a treatment together or walk through a treatment that's been done or whatever that is. So I think one thing that's more effective than just the table sitting is the actual having to go out and see what certain prescriptions look like, or actually have some of those debates in the field. I mean, then you're just standing around, but you're standing in trees instead of sitting at a table, I guess. But I do think that that's something we hear about as being more effective. I'm sure there's more. I'll have to think about it. But it's a good point. I think a lot of people can get stuck on you can lose a lot of momentum on the sitting around the table, especially if it's a lot of people going to the same meetings talking about similar things.
Okay, thanks a lot, Heidi.
Thanks.